Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Today, I'm joined by Eric Langer, President of BioPlan Associates, which has recently released its 22nd annual report on biopharmaceutical manufacturing capacity and production. Eric has been tracking the bioprocessing industry throughout his career and is recognised as one of the leading authorities on biopharmaceutical manufacturing trends and market dynamics. For over 2 decades, BioPlan has been surveying biopharmaceutical manufacturers, CDMOs and industry suppliers across the globe to track capacity utilisation, technology adoption and market trends. Today, we'll be exploring the surge in outsourcing budgets, why quality trumps cost in CMO selection, geographic shifts in manufacturing, and the talent shortage threatening industry capacity. So thank you for joining me, Eric. You've been running this survey tracking biomanufacturing trends for 22 years now. Can you walk us through what this study actually measures and why industry-wide data like this is so important?
Thank you, Dora, for the opportunity to share some of the findings that we've developed over decades that we've been running this survey. It started out probably about 25 years ago with us seeking to determine whether or not the capacity constraints that people had been talking about back that time were actually creating the disruptions that we were hearing. In other words, there was this continuing buzz around a specific trend, and people were making big investments into things like bricks and mortar, hiring, budget changes, capacity expansions, etc. And all of this stuff as they were trying to determine whether or not that contract manufacturing build versus buy factors would play into the story. We realize that if you don't have actual hardcore data, it's very difficult to make a strategic decision. So we decided it was time for us to put together a tool for the industry to be able to consistently measure trends, and it simply expanded over time and over the decades. So at this point, we've probably got, I think it's 550 pages, 200 and some graphs and data on hundreds of different bioprocessing related issues that we felt and feel we need to cover.
Absolutely. I've skimmed through your very comprehensive report, should I say. The amount of data you have there is just astounding, really. Zooming in then to just sections of it, according to your data, outsourcing budgets are projected to increase by 11% in 2025. What's driving that growth?
Well, mostly, absolutely underlying drivers for the biopharma industry growth is, it's really the demand for the biologics themselves. I mean, let's face it, this is a global issue. Healthcare is not dependent on borders. Everybody needs these life-saving therapies. So it's more a question of, as the pipeline continues to put out more of these life-saving drugs, as more than half of the world's population in developing regions develop the economic base to be able to afford those better health cares and these wonder drugs. It's not unexpected that the demand for the biologics will increase, and therefore the demand for outsourcing, which I suspect we can touch on later, is also going to increase. But I think the real excitement comes from the innovative therapies like cell and gene and ADCs, and these are all advancing in the same way that monoclonals were advancing 20-some, 30-some years ago even. So what we're seeing here is a continuing advancement as monoclonals become mainstream. It's just another pharmaceutical. You turn around and there's a cell therapy that nobody had ever considered that's now emerging into the market. And a lot of to your point about outsourcing, a lot of these innovative technologies just plain don't have the kinds of quality manufacturing or technical expertise necessary to produce them. So they have, you've got a lot of these emerging innovators, and the developers are coming from academic settings, for example. They don't have core competencies necessary to produce a biologic, either at clinical or even commercial scale. And this makes CDMOs absolutely indispensable in many situations, or at least some situations. And that's what's really continuing to increase budgets for outsourcing, that and a number of other factors.
that increase in biologics and complex modalities is increasing outsourcing demand to keep up with the demand and have the expertise that are needed for these complex modalities. Interesting. So you distinguish between tactical outsourcing and strategic outsourcing in your report. What does your data show about how that relationship is evolving?
Well, yeah, and the terms tactical and strategic are variable, but in general, when we think about strategic, we think about what the organization seeks to accomplish. And when we think about tactical, we think something that they have an acute challenge or a problem. And what we're seeing here in the bioprocessing industry are, as companies, as innovators, whether they're emerging or deciding to build a new facility, and we've researched this, by the way, over many years, the build versus buy, the make versus buy decision in deciding to go and outsource. And what we found was that essentially every biologics developer really needs at the very beginning of their formation, they need to decide whether or not their company wants to be a biological developer, that including the innovator, a manufacturer, or both. And early on in that development, some feel the core value they bring is the R&D and not the manufacturing. Others feel the other way around, that if you don't have commercial scale production competence, you are missing a core competency that adds to the value of that organization. So the strategic outsourcing could potentially stem from the organization's persona and the philosophy of the founders. On the tactical side, some of the companies just plain need flex capacity to be able to produce a biologic. Sometimes it's for their own capacity expansion. Sometimes it's to produce a biologic in a different region when they don't have sufficient capacity in their own facility. Sometimes they need to be producing a biologic in a specific region or country for various reasons, and they need to have those CDMO partners available, and that becomes a tactical, time-sensitive issue.
That makes sense. And I guess there's room for both tactical and strategic partnerships in the CDMO landscape. It's just kind of deciding where your priorities are and what your needs are. So analytical testing topped your list of most outsourced activities, over 83%. Why are certain functions like testing and validation outsourced so heavily compared to other operations that might maintain in-house?
Very good question. This again goes back to the issue of perception of what in-house core competencies should be. Most large facilities have these capabilities, but may still decide that doing the operations outsourced is more sensible. They may decide that certain facilities or certain programs are going to be used in-house, and others are going to be partners with those that can frankly do it better in many people's eyes. Some see testing as really highly specialized and a skill that requires a lot of equipment and logistical capabilities, that dedicated service providers often, they're the ones that know how to do it. They've been doing it for decades, and they are perceived to do it better.
And so how can companies decide that whether to outsource or whether to build capabilities in-house?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think the challenge is, again, it goes back to the issue of what they perceive as their core competency, what's going to add value to that organization, and they'll have to do the calculus themselves. What we found, which was rather interesting, was when we evaluated, we do custom studies, and we evaluated the process through which organizations determine whether or not they're going to build versus buy. Um, and it was not, it was very difficult to correlate the type of organization or the size, but what we could correlate was the organization's expectation of essentially what their organization represents. Are they innovation? If they're innovation, bang, they're probably going to focus their resources there on their pipeline. If they're manufacturing, well, they may be more inclined to build in-house. We see regionally, geographically, Places like China are more manufacturing oriented, and often they will prefer to have everything in-house because that provides them greatest flexibility, and it also provides them with the expectation that they're building all the potential in-house value.
Beyond quantifiable and strategic sort of metrics, it also comes down to company mission and vision and culture. That is fascinating. Moving on then, the US captured almost 75% of outsourcing intentions in your last report, the highest ever recorded. And also India is being considered by nearly a quarter of both European and US companies as an outsourcing destination. What's happening geographically that's reshaping the manufacturing map?
As you know, geographical trends are the hot topic these days, and bioprocessing and international contract manufacturing, that's not been exempt from this. But what we've seen is bioprocessing and international contract manufacturing have increased at a rate at around 5% annually, year on year, strangely exceptional consistency for over 20 years. In 2006, as an example, for mammalian cell cultures, we found 58% would do no outsourcing. This was in 2006. They would all do it in-house. This year, only 22% of the respondents to our study showed that they would do no outsourcing, i.e., they would do all of their production in-house. And that, I think, is a best indicator that the industry's perception of what manufacturing should look like for them doesn't matter how they're going to break that make versus buy decision. Overall, organizations are simply recognizing that they will not do it all in-house. For strategic or tactical reasons, doesn't matter. The fact is, it's all become the norm to expect some stuff to be outsourced. And, of course, there's a big difference between outsourcing and offshoring. Now, and that's where we talk about the U.S. capturing 75% of the outsourcing intention. That question was around where did the respondents, the VPs or directors of manufacturing, perceive a particular international country as a potential outsourcing destination. In other words, that would be offshoring. And what we found was that back at the beginning of this year, in December and January when we did the data collection, we found that it was about 75% said, yeah, the U.S. is an option. This is significantly higher than it was pre-COVID. I think part of the COVID effect played into some of this recognition and reshuffling of the geographies and perception of where manufacturing could and should take place. But our annual report, it shows a lot of uncertainty today around things like supply chains. This year, when we're going to be measuring it, we're going to find a lot of uncertainty around tariffs and demand for international investment in local manufacturing. So what we'd like to see in this upcoming study, where while we saw nearly 75% of the global industry saw the U.S. as a possible outsourcing destination, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that figure changes in light of the disruptions that we're seeing. Some global investors have used words like, we will wait for more stability before making plans. That kind of wait and see shift may play into some of the decision making. In India, you'd mentioned India as well. They really have been a powerhouse, of course, in small manufacturing, contract manufacturing, small molecule contract manufacturing. In biologics, however, China really took that leadership role. It was probably the 1990s or even earlier when the Chinese started to make the decision in their 5-year plans / outlines that they would take a much more focused investment approach. And this, for China, has paid off in that there are now well over 200 biologics facilities that we have tracked for 20 years in China, and at least one of the world's top 5 largest contract manufacturers in China now. India, on the other hand, is still focusing on their small molecule while moving into the large molecule space. But I think it's been a slower, less focused effort.
So, what role do you see Asia in general? I guess that would mostly be India and China. What role do you see Asia playing in the outsourcing picture over the next, say, 5 years?
Well, India and China make up the majority of the population of the world, so they really are an attractive market, and one that no outsourcing or innovative molecule manufacturer can afford to ignore. Uh, and that's partly because of the increasing domestic economic power that they've been developing over the last few decades. The Indian facilities, however, are still developing the expertise required for the production of biologics versus the small molecule in which they currently have great expertise. But again, this is evolving rapidly. So investment in CDMOs in India is most definitely likely to continue.
Moving on, you found that quality compliance was the most important issue manufacturers prioritize when choosing a CMO. 87.3% of respondents, even above cost considerations. What's driving this intense focus on quality right now? Has this always been a top priority, or is this a shift you've observed?
Now, this is quality is realistically likely demanded not just by 87%, but by 100%. It's essentially the ante to be even in the game. The other 13% that did not respond that it was critical were probably just assuming that it's a given. Essentially, you can't produce to the regulators quality expectations. If you can't do that, then you're simply not in business. And we've seen this in our custom research year after year that cost, for example, while it's important, does not really come into play if the CDMO can't demonstrate international quality standards. Nobody is going to take a chance on $1 million batch to save a few dollars on their manufacturing. Just won't happen.
It's also interesting that Be Local to Me has consistently ranked last in CMO selection criteria for your report for 19 years straight. Yet I find there is so much talk in the industry about nearshoring and supply chain resilience post-COVID. Having a CDMO that's local to you is seen as a very big advantage for multiple reasons. How do you explain those conflicting trends?
Yeah, I think that surprised us as well, because even back decades ago, we saw that there was a lot of conversation about the importance of being local and having access to their service providers. But I think a couple of things have changed over those time periods. One is accessibility of the technology to allow us to have these very in-depth communications via video, for example. The recognition that it's possible to produce without having to have person and staff in plant like they used to have is, I think, also another indication of the maturation of the industry. So this issue of being local then becomes a issue of convenience. Essentially, I expect 100% of decision makers would prefer being local for their convenience. But how much are they really going to pay for a facility to be within a day's drive of them? Probably, realistically, not a whole lot, especially if the expertise that's required resides elsewhere, including out of the country. Companies will do their development in the EU, their API in Asia, their fill finish in Turkey. So this internationalization of the industry, I think, is a remarkable indicator of the integration of the different components and operations that is required to produce and fill and market a biologic. The smaller companies may feel the need to have access to their service providers, but when strong relationships, ultimately are established, the inconvenience of time zone coordination or the additional air travel that may become necessary, I think those tend to become a minor issue. So when you hear people talk about being local to me, I think the short answer is that's a preference, but it's not. When you look at the top three decision factors, it just won't show up there.
Let's move on to talk about talent and hiring. Your survey revealed that 34% of the industry is struggling with hiring in process development roles. If companies can't staff their own facilities and CMOs are facing similar constraints, how do you see this talent shortage impacting the industry's ability to meet production demands?
Oh, yeah, this is a big one, I think, and we've seen this happen over the last 20 plus years. The thread goes, in order to keep up with the 12% annual growth in biologics demand, which equates to a doubling of the market for the biologics and therapeutics every 5 years, even with an industry that's competent to train, that kind of growth requires more people, more trained people, more staff than the industry right now is effectively capable of training. Process engineers, process development, upstream and downstream. These are just some of the critical roles that have been notoriously difficult to fill. And in our study, we find that between 29% and 34% of the industry is reporting having difficulties hiring for their existing operations, existing ones. So if you decide that you're going to expand, well, you'd really realistically had better have a not just a hiring strategy in place, but also a retention strategy. Because if you have these challenges, you know your neighbor is having the same challenge, and being able to retain those really good employees and staff that you've meticulously trained for 5 or 10 years, and somebody, their neighbor uh, decides that they can't manufacture unless they have that expertise in a gene therapy, for example, price will be no object. And being able to retain somebody will not be an issue of, well, I'll give you a 10% raise. It's not going to be sufficient.
Moving on then, you've identified a gap between what companies say they'll adopt, like continuous bioprocessing and automation, versus what actually gets implemented, doing this survey for so many years. What advice would you give to manufacturing leaders trying to separate genuine opportunities from what might just be a hot topic at the time, industry hype?
Yeah, I think industry hype is a reasonable word. The This industry has always, at least in our experience and our research, has always been interested in improving the technology. There's a real The scientists involved here have a real gee whiz attitude when somebody comes up with something interesting and new, and they really they would like to see it and evaluate it, for example. Um, this is especially true in mammalian systems. Microbial systems, especially when you're talking about industrial scale, there's a slightly different attitude. But in the microbial or the cell and gene therapy world in particular, if you've got something interesting and you can demonstrate that it's new and potentially could improve productivity or solve a problem, there's a lot of natural curiosity in these new technologies. You can say, well, some of it's to reduce cost and improve productivity. Yeah, but there's just this attitude that if it's new and relevant, it could really be the next best thing to enable the technology. It could be an enabling technology that could allow them to manufacture in a way that they hadn't before. And that kind of disruption has always been attractive to the industry. So, when we say they would like to adopt, they really are being truthful. The challenge is that the true reality here is that in a regulated environment, the evaluation process 100% of the time needs to precede adoption. And while you have many really truly earnest interests in continuous bioprocessing or process intensification or automation, actually fitting these advances into their process to do the evaluation, it requires a lot of time, testing, and planning. And these tests can cost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in consumables and staff time. So it's not like it might be where in other industries where they say, well, let's go ahead and plug this in and see if it actually works. And if it does, we'll buy it. It's a huge years-long process to actually make it happen. So when it does actually happen, it requires a lot of resource. And we've given our industry suppliers, in fact, the opportunity to have their innovations tested and evaluated on paper. In other words, if somebody comes to us and says, well, we've got this very innovative alternative to a centrifuge for clarification or whatnot, we'd like to see whether or not it's adoptable. We've done that for years, where we've tested the viability of an alternative film, of an alternative sensor. And what we found for decades is that there often is a great interest, but when you dig down deep, so if you simply ask, are you interested in this? Would you consider buying it? Their answer 100% of the time will be yes. But when you dig down deep and say, well, when might you actually evaluate this technology? The answer tends to be very different when they start to actually have to think about, well, I guess we'd have to do this in process, and that's going to take us weeks of time, or even potentially multi-weeks if it's a continuous process, and a whole lot of consumables. Then they start to step back and start to determine, is this something we could actually evaluate? And you get a very different answer the more deeply you dig. So we've actually begun to do some at-site beta testing assessment processes, where we provide the support for those that are innovating these services, the opportunity to actually beta test and generate some actual usable results that the facility, the stakeholders can use to rely on to decide about implementation, but also the industry can determine whether or not there's broader adoptability, and where they can use somebody else's data to determine whether or not they should even bother to evaluate. But again, if you don't have an evaluation, you'll never make a sale on an innovation. To your question about the advice, especially those who are relatively new to the industry, about adding or introducing a new technology, I would strongly recommend that they not underestimate the real world testing and data necessary to make those decisions, because again, nobody is going to buy anything until the decision makers have had an opportunity to evaluate that technology in-house.
Yeah, absolutely. So for startups without manufacturing competence, obviously outsourcing isn't really just preferred, it's essential. That build versus buy decision becomes quite easy if you don't really have the capital or expertise to support that build. How should emerging biotech companies approach CMO partnerships differently than big established pharma?
I think emerging biotech decision makers are often really unaware of the complexities involved in the contract bioprocessing, unless they really are lucky and happen to pick up a compatible CDMO partner. They may end up frustrated because simple things like miscommunication and project mismanagement, these things, because you're dealing with scientists on both ends of that partnership, they often discount the necessity for the human factor here. Communication and management, scheduling, etc., can ruin an otherwise great relationship. So the short advice is, I think, talk directly and at length. If you were selecting a CDMO partner, talk at length with the project managers at the CDMO, not just the sales folks or the BD people, but the ones that you're going to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, because they're the ones that are going to make or break that relationship. And that it's not just, I'm mad at that person. It means a product may not be manufactured on time or on budget. So you need to see whether or not there's a compatible work and communication style. I mean, we've been measuring this in our annual report, for example, for years, and it doesn't seem to change that much. So the CDMOs, while they are improving their client management processes, not all of them have reached that level. So the advice I think to consider would be, don't underestimate the importance of communication and of the necessity to establish a good working relationship. I mean, for example, we found that when we talked to the CDMOs, we found that the question for the CDMOs, when we asked them, clients don't communicate with us effectively is a major problem. 78% recently of CDMOs mentioned that. In prior years, it had reached 100% of the CDMOs say clients don't communicate with us. What this means is that there's a disconnect between both sides in terms of communication, and to be able to figure out how you can effectively do that job, you're going to need to start with a project manager, and understanding that their communication role is vital. And if it doesn't feel right, it won't work out.
Looking ahead, the next 5 years, say, what's one trend in biomanufacturing outsourcing that you think most industry leaders are underestimating or overlooking right now?
That's a good question. It's possible that AI, it might actually be the most overestimated trend, but in some ways that may end up being part of its downfall. We're actually researching this year and benchmarking the extent to which AI is implementation is actually taking place in biopharmaceuticals and biopharmaceutical manufacturing. And we'll continue measuring that over time so that, say by the 2030 timeline, we'll probably have a much better sense of where that trend is going and how and where AI is actually being used. This trend analysis can help identify where the opportunities need to actually be invested, and it might provide a little bit of a leading edge opportunity for assessment there. Underestimated trend might include adoption of more effective, cheaper things like multi-parameter and single-use sensors that integrate into that automation, because in order for AI or automation to take place, or for AI to enable automation, for example, you're going to need to be able to measure stuff. And if you don't have an effective way to measure the parameters in a process, the automation will continue to be aspirational, and you will still be talking about this 5 years from now, and the industry will not have had the opportunity to benefit from those efficiencies.
That's interesting, your study on whether AI is industry hype or if it actually has tangible benefits to the industry. How are you collecting that data, and do you have any sort of preliminary information you can share?
We've brought together a number of industry authors and advisors on AI to be able to help identify what the key issues are, so that we can formulate questions around how AI might be adopted and where it's actually creating benefit. And so part of our annual study this year, which we'll be launching next month, will be the formulating the issues that we could then start to measure. So I think we don't have anything right now to be able to point to, but we do know what the questions are. And I think if you don't ask the questions right now, early on, then being able to track that over time and see how the industry is changing its behavior is not going to be nearly as relevant or interesting. So.
Great. Well, Eric, thanks a lot for your time today. We're coming to the end of the podcast, but finally, for any listeners who want to dive deeper into these trends or access the full report data, what's the best way to connect with BioPlan Associates?
We've got our website, bioplanassociates.com. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, or feel free to call. We've got decades of data and research on hundreds of projects we've done over that time, and we pleased to share our public data to the extent that we can. We'd love to do that.